Welcome. This is the GOG Partners series on accrual culture and education series on how to build a successful clinical trial network. And I'm joined today, and it's really my great pleasure to be joined by Dr. Sharon Lewin, who's the Director of GYN Oncology at Holy Name Hospital in New Jersey. Sharon, welcome.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, we're gonna talk, Sharon. Today's episode's entitled "Sustainability and Lessons Learned," and I think that there's so much to think about. And you've experienced it all. You were at a place like WashU. You were at Columbia as an attending, and then you went out on your own, but yet wanted to continue to carry that research flag, which I know really is something that inspires you very much. And we've all been beneficiaries of that spirit that you have, and certainly your patients have as well. But tell us, how do you go from a place where there is that culture of research, and now you move to a place that probably doesn't have it as much, or I may be mischaracterizing it. So how did you get to be so successful at what you're doing? And for the audience that's out there, Sharon is fantastic at enrolling patients. Her site has become fantastic at first patient in terms of getting trials open. So you're pounding it out of the park on multiple levels, Sharon. So tell us a little bit of sort of what were the steps that you took to get to where you are.
Well, first of all, Tom, it's such an honor to be here. I mean, never did I think when we opened our first trial that I would actually be, interviewed by GOG Partners in terms of a site, to talk about my experience. So, I'm just really honored and thrilled. And thank you for those flattering words. I mean, just to tell
You've
people,
earned them. You really
thank
earned
you.
them.
Just to tell people who are listening that I work in a community hospital. It's small. I came from these big academic institutions, and I think that being in a community site, we're very nimble. We can do things quickly. We don't have a lot of bureaucracy, and just to tell anyone listening that I was really the first oncologist in the history of this 90-year hospital to do oncology research. And so if you want to do it, you definitely can. I just hope this is really an inspiring message to know that you absolutely can do it and do it very well. And I would love to, share some of the things that I've learned, but it is very possible to do.
That's great. Tell us, what's the first thing you did then? And were you just sort of flying? You knew where you wanted to go, or did you sort of have a process map? Sort of how did that all work out?
To be honest, I really didn't have a process mapped at all. And so, now looking back, I wish I had reached out to the GOG or some of my former mentors and said, I'm really interested in clinical trial research. How do I get this started? So that would be, one thing to really recommend is that don't be afraid to reach out. There's so many of us and mentors that can really be out there to guide and help you. So I really should have done that. Honestly, the way the whole thing started for me, I had some relationships with industry just from different speaking engagements. And whenever the MSLs would want to meet with me to talk about things, I would always meet with them just to learn more about what's coming down the pipeline. And one of them actually said, maybe we should give your site a try and, see how you do with research. And so we actually opened an AstraZeneca trial. That was really the first study that we opened. And of course, the first one was the toughest in terms of the trials and tribulations. And then I can definitely tell you the steps from there. But
yeah, so what were those steps? I think people would love to know that. What were the things that were hurdles that you really needed to overcome, or what are the first things you needed to do to get the program off the ground?
Great questions. So I did go to our hospital administration and said, this is really important to me. It's good for building a practice and, building your name. And of course, really important for patients, which that's really the bottom line. And the hospital administration was actually very supportive. So I think institutional support is really helpful. As I mentioned, I was really the first oncologist to do research here. So they said, well, let's have you speak with this research team. And they were doing infectious disease research and research with the interventional radiologist. So definitely different than oncology, but they sort of paired me up with a coordinator and a regulatory coordinator. And those two people helped at least in a part-time fashion with the nuts and bolts of getting these trials opened. I mean, some of the biggest hurdles, just step by step, we first got access to the trial. We actually use WERB, which is Western IRB. So we don't have our own IRB. So if you're a small hospital and you want to use some type of central IRB, you absolutely can. And this regulatory coordinator was very helpful at submitting the documents. And then, of course, it had to go through attorney review at our hospital. And that was probably the longest portion of the first trial. A lot of back and forth with the attorneys on contracts. And once those things were actually solidified, approval with WERB or Western IRB, approval with our hospital attorney, some type of part-time support from these two regulatory and patient coordinators, we were eventually able to open the study. But again, the first one was the hardest to open.
So if I could paraphrase, then basically, it's get to a decision maker in the administration, get their support so that there's resources, and then those resources followed with where you had a coordinator who could help you with regulatory, and then you had a clinical research coordinator who could help you actually enroll patients and collect data. And then you started the regulatory process by doing a much more streamlined process of centralized IRB, which generally is much faster, and it's very helpful in that. Were there any hurdles at that point, or did things start coming together pretty well, or did you have further things that you needed to do?
I think, there were a lot of hurdles initially with legal because the hospital attorney wasn't familiar with really reading these industry and regulatory contracts. So that took a lot of meetings and pushing that forward. I think the biggest lesson is just to be persistent and to, keep at it, which is certainly what I did. But then once we had the trial open, of course, there were some other hurdles like educating our radiologists about reading with RECIST criteria. I mean, if you're coming from a big academic place, those type of things are already well greased for you. But when you're just starting out in oncology, you kind of really have to go back to the nuts and bolts basics. And I have to say that a CRA for this AstraZeneca study was very helpful, giving us the worksheets for RECIST criteria, which we now use on all of our studies. But, those are some things that, like having a peer mentor, like if there's anyone out there in a community site who's really starting from scratch, I would be happy to, be like a mentor to guide to get these things open.
No, that's great. So the next phase of this is really all the things you encounter, which we encounter on an everyday basis, such as legal, institutional indemnification is a big hurdling, big thing to hurdle, I think, for many people, whether you're at a small or a bigger institution. Institutions by nature are risk adverse, and an indemnification issue becomes sticky. And then tell me a little bit how you handled RECIST, because that's a challenge everywhere also, in that you could reward radiology for their, there's several ways you can go. You can declare that it's the standard of care and you should just do it, which sometimes works but often doesn't. You can befriend a radiologist and promise them, some perks such as potential authorship on investigator-initiated trials or some other things. Or, of course, there's always financial incentives. Which path did you walk down in terms of?
So I actually befriended the head of radiology, who actually came from Columbia and is, I guess, sort of academically minded as well. And so we designated her really as the point person to read all of these studies, because it does help to have just one person. And she delegated one other person if, she's not available. So we really have two people for consistency that are reading these studies, and we order them and say these patients are on clinical trial. They have to be read by these two people using RECIST criteria, and we give them the worksheets. So it's like a lot of really basic, important details, but it's really critically important. I guess when I first started, I didn't realize I would be getting into that level of detail, to be honest, but it's what's necessary to make these trials really run effectively.
Yeah, these clinical trials can almost mesmerize you initially, right? Because you sign a letter, a confidentiality agreement to review the trial, and you sort of get the overview. And the overview is really nice. It's this interesting drug with this interesting mechanism of action. You haven't really seen all the exclusion criteria. you haven't seen all the demands on both you as a PI when you sign your 1572 or on your staff. And then when you start doing multiple trials, those things really really can multiply in a hurry. So it really becomes problematic. One of the next things it sounds like you did, though, was develop some SOPs and checklists that
Correct.
you use from
That's
trial to
correct.
trial, which I think is a really good piece of advice as well.
Exactly.
So that's really helpful. So how did you grow it then? How did you have to get more staff? How did you? How many trials do you have open roughly?
So I was just counting actually before this call. Right now, I mean, we've had about 15 or so open. Several of the trials have closed. Just to show you where we've grown, I mean, we had a couple of audits because we were high enrollers, and we actually
FDA.
passed, not FDA, but sponsor audits.
Right.
But we actually passed those with flying colors. So it made me feel like really great too that we have our SOPs have been working nicely. But it kind of snowballs from there. I think the first trial, as we said, is the hardest to get open. But if you can actually enroll quite a bit and show really quality research, it's better to have just a few trials open, I think, at the beginning and to enroll and show really quality product. And then it can kind of grow from there.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that's true of big sites as well. We just had a discussion in our division. We've got so many things open right now. And there was a phase 1 that was interesting and so forth. And I said, we really got to keep our eye on the ball because it's real easy to get overextended. So I think you're absolutely right. Sharon, in the last few minutes we have, one of this parts of this episode was lessons learned. What would you say your biggest lesson, and maybe we've already said it, but what were the biggest 1 or 2 lessons that you learned? And what, it sounds like at the beginning you told people to go out and get advice, including GOG partners, which I endorse. What other lessons would you give to people?
Of course, how meaningful and rewarding it is to do clinical research. I think now that I'm an investigator, I really see it in terms of not only the benefits for the patients, of course, but the benefits, for our practice and our hospital, and of course, to be a part of something larger to help the GOG Foundation and partners. So that's an important lesson, and just that anyone can really do this. I mean, if I can do this starting from nothing other than, of course, institutional support, which is very helpful, but I don't know why any institution would not support this because it's good for patients. You can do it. I mean, you really can. And there are a lot of us out there to help.
For someone who's sitting on the fence saying, well, Sharon's a really hard worker. She's really smart. I don't know. Is there enough secondary gain from doing this? What would you tell them? Is it more of a hassle, or do you get more satisfaction out of it? How does that
Definitely
work?
Much more satisfaction. And I have to say, there were many times when I said, oh my gosh, I'm beating my head against the wall, particularly with the legal things. But once you get over those hurdles, I have to say, now we open trials very quickly. Several of the studies, as you mentioned, Tom, that have come to us from the GOG, for example, we've been the first one in the country to open because now we've been through all of those initial hurdles. But it's so worth it. It's so worth it for you and your patients. And, there are just so many tools available now to help.
Sharon, thanks so much for sharing your experiences with us today. I think they're going to be of great value to
My pleasure.
Our listeners. And thank you for being such an amazing site and principal investigator at Holy Name. We really appreciate it. So on behalf of GOG Partners, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. We learned about sustainability and the lessons learned. And I hope you actually did learn something because I sure did. So again, thank you for joining us. And again, Sharon, thank you.
Thank you.